Every morning you step over the most attacked spiritual boundary in your home. Not the altar, if you have one. Not the bedroom where you sleep. Not the kitchen where the food is made. The doorstep. That 4 or 5 centimeters of stone or wood or concrete between the protected interior of your home and everything the day is about to send through it. You step over it without stopping. You leave it undefended. You walk through it unmarked. Solomon never did that. Not once. Not in 40 years of the most spiritually guarded reign in the history of the ancient world. Solomon placed 10 massive bronze water basins at the entrances to the most sacred building on earth. Not at the altar, not at the Holy of Holies, not in the center of the sanctuary where the presence of God dwelled behind the veil. At the doorways, at the thresholds, at every point where the outside met the inside. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 27 through 39. 10 bronze stands. 10 basins, each holding 40 baths of water. Approximately 880 liters each. Positioned, by deliberate architectural specification, at the threshold gates of the temple complex. The first thing any person or any spirit encountered when approaching the house of God was water. That was not an accident. Solomon spent 75,000 kilograms of bronze on that architectural decision, not on additional walls, not on more gold overlay, not on further ceremonial objects in the interior, on the thresholds, on water at the entry points, on 10 basins that guaranteed what crosses this boundary crosses through water first. Every morning you pour water on your doorstep. You are building, with a cup, what Solomon built with bronze. The difference between you and Solomon is not authority, it is scale. 1 Kings chapter 7 requires slow reading. Most people who cite this passage read it as an inventory of Solomon's wealth and architectural ambition. The 10 lavers become a detail among other temple furnishings, impressive in scale, but not carrying specific instruction for the household. I want to read it differently. Not as inventory, as instruction. The passage describes each bronze stand in technical detail. 4 cubits wide, 4 cubits long, 3 cubits high, panels of hammered bronze, frames carved with lions and oxen and cherubim, wheels of bronze with bronze axles, everything measured, everything positioned, and then the positioning. Verse 38. He made 10 lavers of bronze, 1 laver on each stand, and he put 5 on the right side of the house and 5 on the left side of the house. Right side and left side. This is the architectural language of entrances. The lavers did not sit in the sanctuary. They did not stand beside the altar of incense or before the ark. They sat at the gates. Anyone entering the temple complex, priest, worshiper, king, visiting dignitary, passed water on both sides. The boundary between the holy and the profane is marked and maintained by water. Solomon did not invent this theology. He built it large so that no one who approached the temple could miss it. And before the 10 lavers, there was something larger still. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 23 through 26. The Molten Sea. A single massive circular bronze basin, 5 meters in diameter, standing on the backs of 12 bronze oxen, arranged in groups of 3 facing the 4 cardinal directions, located in the entrance court of the temple. The scholars Yigael Yadin and Carol Myers, working separately on temple architecture from the 1960s through the 1970s, observed something that the text does not state explicitly, but that the theological context makes unavoidable. The Molten Sea was the cosmic ocean. In ancient Near Eastern cosmology shared across Canaan, Babylon, and Egypt, the primordial waters, the deep, the Tehom, the formless medium that existed before creation, were understood as what God brought order out of. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. To pass through water at the threshold of God's house was to re-enter the condition of creation, to move from the disordered outside into the ordered, protected inside, to cross from what is unaccounted for into what has been declared belonging to God. Solomon placed the cosmic ocean at the front door. The Molten Sea said this: "What crosses here moves through what was present at the beginning. What crosses here is accounted for. What crosses here enters knowing what this space is and whose it is." Then 10 more basins, flanking the gates, repeated the principle at every additional entry point. Water, at the threshold. Everywhere, continuously. This was not ceremonial excess. This was the most deliberate architectural theology in the ancient world. There is a thread older than Solomon in this practice, and I want to follow it to its source. Numbers chapter 19. This is one of the stranger passages in the Torah, and I say that as someone who has spent 30 years working with difficult texts. It describes the preparation of the waters of lustration, the mei nidah, the purifying water, made from the ashes of a red heifer dissolved in spring water. The instructions are elaborate. The process is specific. The result is a substance designated for one primary function. Listen carefully to where the Torah says this water belongs. Not on the altar, not in the sanctuary. Numbers chapter 19, verse 18. "And a clean person shall take hyssop and dip it in the water and sprinkle it on the tent, on all the vessels, on the persons who were there, and on the doorway." The doorway. The threshold. The primary target of the Torah's purifying water is not the body of the person entering. It is the boundary itself. The entry point, the place where outside meets inside. And when I read this alongside the 10 lavers of 1 Kings chapter 7, the pattern becomes unavoidable. Solomon did not invent threshold water theology. He received it from Sinai and built it at temple scale. The principle had been inside the covenant since Moses. The doorway was always the primary target. The threshold was always where the purifying substance belonged. Solomon built the bronze lavers so large, so numerous, so undeniable, that no one who entered the temple could ever again look at a doorway and see it as ordinary architecture. Every doorway is a threshold. Every threshold is a covenant point. Every covenant point requires water. Now, let me take you somewhere much closer to home. Let me take you to the doorway of the compound where you grew up, or the house where your mother grew up, or the place where your grandmother still does, before the household wakes, what she has always done. Before anyone leaves for school, for work, for market. Before a single foot crosses the threshold outward. Someone pours water on the step. In the Yoruba tradition, this practice has a name. Tutu. Cool water, poured at the doorstep before the morning begins. The description given across generations is consistent. You are clearing the path. You are cooling whatever hostile presence has gathered at the boundary during the night. You are resetting the threshold so that what moves through it in the morning moves through something acknowledged and declared. In communities where this practice is understood in its original framework, the threshold is the domain of Eshu Elegba, the guardian of the boundary between interior and exterior, between what is permitted to enter and what is not. In the Pentecostal reframing adopted by many Yoruba Christians, the theology transfers directly. The Holy Spirit governs the threshold. Morning water is the activation of that governance. Different name for the guardian. Same principle. Water at the boundary before the day moves through it. In Igbo tradition, the morning washing of the threshold is called ife mmiri, the work of water, performed before any member of the family leaves, before the door opens outward to the morning. The water goes down first. Then the household moves through the boundary it has reset. What I find remarkable about the description of this practice in Igbo communities is the specific language used. The water reads what approaches. What comes toward the house today must first pass through the watermark at the edge. The water knows what belongs here and what does not. This is not folklore. This is a sophisticated understanding of threshold function. The water marks the boundary. The boundary accounts for entry. What passes through an unmarked threshold is unaccounted for. What passes through a marked threshold has been declared upon. In Zulu and Ndebele tradition, water is poured at the entrance of the homestead each morning for protection and ancestral clarity. Across the southern African spiritual landscape, the principle appears consistently. Water at the threshold in the morning is the daily resetting of the boundary between the protected interior and what the exterior holds. And then there is Ethiopia. Ethiopia alone among the world's Christian traditions has never lost the explicit connection between the doorstep water practice and Solomon. The daily household blessing in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, still performed, still passed from mother to daughter in the same unbroken line that traces back to the Queen of Sheba, begins with pouring blessed water at the main entrance of the home, not silently, with invocation. Solomon is named. The authority of the ark, which Ethiopia holds as custodian, is named. The doorstep water practice is not anonymous in Ethiopia. It is not a custom whose origin has been forgotten. It is explicit. Named. Theologically sourced in the Solomonic tradition, the only living Christian tradition that never lost the connection between water at the threshold and the covenant of the king who built the temple. Think about this line of transmission. Bronze lavers in Jerusalem, Solomonic manuscripts carried across the trans-Saharan routes by Islamic scholars between the 8th and 16th centuries. The manuscript libraries of Timbuktu, where protective household knowledge was copied and taught alongside the Quran. Ethiopian Orthodox liturgical memory preserved in institutions running continuously for 2,000 years. Igbo grandmothers performing ife mmiri in the compound before dawn. The scale changed across every generation and every geography. The substance was always water. The location was always the threshold. The timing was always the morning. Your grandmother did not call it Solomon's purification. She called it the morning. She was more right than she had any way of knowing. I need to tell you about Jerusalem. I was 47 years old. A research trip specifically to study temple threshold architecture. The first time in over 20 years of scholarship that I went to Israel not to read about the temple from manuscripts, but to stand at the site and walk the ground that Solomon's architects had planned. I was staying near the Damascus Gate of the Old City. If you have not been to the Damascus Gate before 5:30 in the morning, before the tourist movement begins, before the souvenir stalls open, before the steps fill, I will try to describe it. The stone is very old in a way that you feel in the back of your throat. Not old like a museum display preserved behind glass. Old like a living wall that has been touched by so many hands across so many centuries that the stone has absorbed the weight of it. 2,000 years minimum. 3,000 years behind that. I was walking to the gate each morning to read in the pre-dawn stillness. On the third morning, in the alley below the gate, a narrow lane of stone buildings pressed close on both sides, running away into the older residential quarter, I noticed a woman, elderly, Arab, moving with the measured deliberateness of someone who has performed the same sequence of morning actions for 50 or 60 years and no longer needs to think about the order. She came to her own front door, a narrow, ancient door set into stone so old it had gone a deep, settled, gray-brown, the color of stone that has been in shadow for centuries. She was carrying a small white pitcher. She poured water, a careful, deliberate pour, not a careless splash, onto the external step, the threshold, the stone that connects the inside of her home to the lane. She stood for a moment with her lips moving, not loudly, not for anyone else's hearing. Then she closed the door and went inside. The next morning she did the same thing. Same time, same picture, same step, same lips moving. On the fourth morning, I was waiting near enough to speak. Her grandson, 12 or 13 years old, already awake at that hour, sitting on a nearby step with the patient expression of a boy who has been doing this duty long enough that it no longer feels unusual, served as translator. I introduced myself, told him I was a scholar studying protective practices at household thresholds in the ancient world. He translated this to his grandmother with a slight compression of the eyebrows that suggested he was not entirely certain this was a reasonable way to spend a morning near the Damascus gate. She listened. Yeah, she looked at me with the calm assessment of a woman who has lived long enough to have encountered several categories of strange scholars and decided most of them are probably harmless. I asked, "The water. Every morning. Why?" She took a moment. The question was not difficult. It was simply so fundamental that putting the answer into words required the same kind of pause it takes to explain to someone why you breathe. She spoke in Arabic, 7 words. Her grandson translated them directly, without elaboration, so that what comes in today is clean. I stood at the Damascus gate at 5:15 in the morning and understood that this woman had given me the entire theology of 1 Kings chapter 7 in a single sentence, so that what comes in today is clean. That is the Molten Sea. That is all 10 lavers. That is the 75,000 kilograms of bronze that Solomon commissioned for the entrance gates of the most sacred building on earth, so that what comes in today is clean. I walked back to my hotel. I opened 1 Kings chapter 7. I have read that chapter perhaps 200 times across 30 years of scholarship. I have cited it in conference papers. I have taught it in seminars in London and Lagos, and at a guest lecture in Nairobi. I had never once read it as a morning practice. I had read it as archaeology, as material evidence, as the record of a king's ambition built into bronze. I had not read it as instruction for what you do with a cup before you open your front door. Standing in that alley in the pre-dawn stillness, listening to a Muslim woman describe Solomon's theology through her grandson's translation, I understood what I had been missing for 30 years. The lavers were never only monumental, they were the teaching model. Solomon built them at temple scale so that everyone who entered the most sacred space on earth would understand the principle and replicate it at the scale available to them. A cup, a pitcher, a bowl of fresh water poured on the external threshold every morning in every house that claimed covenant protection. He built 10 basins in bronze because he could not put a bronze laver at every door in Jerusalem. He expected everyone who saw the 10 to know what to do at their own one. I wrote in my notebook that evening. He built the large so that every household would know what to do with the small. The woman in the alley was doing what every household in Solomon's Jerusalem was supposed to be doing. She just never stopped. Now I want to address something the Testament of Solomon makes explicit, and which most teachers of this text pass over too quickly. The Testament of Solomon, compiled in its present form around the 1st century of this era, but drawing on source material considerably older, records Solomon's systematic interrogation of the spiritual forces he encountered during the building of the temple. Multiple entities describe in their interrogation how they access homes, not through walls, not primarily through windows, through unguarded thresholds. The pattern is consistent across multiple testimonies in the text. An undefended doorstep is an open entry point. Not because the doorstep is weak in itself, because no mark has been placed on it, because the boundary has not been declared, because no substance, no voice, no act of morning covenant has passed over that threshold to say, this entry point is accounted for. And here is what I want you to hold carefully. The demons in the Testament of Solomon do not describe water at the threshold as painful to them. They describe it as a barrier they cannot dissolve. The distinction matters enormously. The morning water is not a weapon. It is not an attack. It is a sealed door. The hostile entity does not encounter the water and suffer. The entity encounters the water and cannot proceed. The entry is denied. The threshold is closed before anything hostile reaches the interior. You are not fighting. You are closing the door before the fight begins. That is what the 10 lavers did at the temple gates. That is what the woman at the Damascus gate has been doing every morning since before her grandson could walk. That is what the cup of water at your doorstep does tomorrow morning. The door is closed. Not because you are stronger than what approaches, because the threshold has been declared. Now let me give you the practice. 6 steps. Every morning, before anyone in your household crosses the threshold outward. Step 1. Fresh water drawn that morning, not stored from the previous day. Not bottled water sitting in plastic from last week. The morning's water for the morning's threshold. The freshness matters theologically, not hygienically. Each morning is a new covenant renewal, not a carried over one. Yesterday's declaration extended by inertia is not a declaration. A fresh act performed at the first light of the day, before the day has moved through the boundary. Use a cup, a bowl, a small pitcher, whatever you have. If possible, use the same vessel every morning. This is your laver. Your household version of Solomon's bronze basin. A vessel becomes what it is consistently used for. Step 2. Before anyone leaves. The timing is the theology. Before you open the front door outward. Before the first member of your household crosses the threshold to begin the day. The water goes down before the day moves through it. Solomon's lavers were filled continuously. The water was present before anyone arrived. The threshold was never unguarded, never allowed to go dry between departures and arrivals. You are doing the same. At the scale of one household, one morning, one cup. Step 3. Open your front door. Stand inside, facing outward. Pour the water onto the external threshold. The step, the mat, the ground just outside the door. The exterior side, not the interior. The direction of the pour is the direction of the protection. What approaches the house must pass through the watermark first. What is gathered at the boundary during the night encounters the declared threshold before it encounters you. Step 4. The declaration. Your voice at the threshold. Speak aloud. This threshold belongs to the covenant of Solomon. What enters this house today enters through water. No witchcraft, no familiar spirit, no hostile assignment crosses this boundary. What God has protected, let nothing touch. Once, calmly. Not a shout, not a whisper that stays in the back of your throat, where no sound actually leaves your body. Your physical voice in the air of the threshold, at the place between the inside and the outside. The voice activates what the thought only intends. The declaration leaves your body and enters the air of the boundary. Speak it. Step 5. Go back inside. Close the door. Do not linger at the threshold after the declaration. The sealing is complete. The boundary is marked. The water will dry. The boundary does not dry with it. The water is the medium. The covenant is the substance. What holds through the day is not the moisture on the step. What holds is the declared boundary, the spoken covenant, the morning act of renewal at the entry point of the house. Step 6. Daily. Every morning. Without exception. This is not the same category as a monthly territorial sealing. This is daily threshold renewal. continuous, like Solomon's lavers, which were filled every day, because each morning brings new approaches. The forces that found a sealed threshold yesterday do not depart and never return. They come back. The threshold must be renewed because the approach is renewed. A daily threshold is a daily kept covenant, not a one-time installation. Every morning, pour, speak, close. I want to say something about the two kinds of people who have reached this point in the video. Some of you are not encountering this for the first time. You watched your mother do this. You stood in the doorway of the compound as a child and watched a hand pour water on the step in the morning light. And you filed it as custom, as habit, as something the women did that no one ever fully explained. This video does not introduce you to a new practice. It returns to you the name of what your family already knew. The women in your family had the correct substance, the correct timing, the correct direction, external threshold before the day begins. They had everything right. They were carrying Solomon's architecture across 30 centuries without knowing the chapter and verse. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 27 through 39. That is the source. That is what they were doing. For those of you who are less certain, who find the manuscript evidence compelling, the cross-cultural transmission remarkable, but who want to maintain a careful distance from the spiritual claims, I will say only this: the practice is documented. The parallel in the ancient Near Eastern sources is established in peer-reviewed scholarship. The West African living tradition is not theoretical. The Ethiopian Orthodox morning blessing is preserved in institutions running continuously for 2,000 years. The woman in the alley near the Damascus Gate has been doing this longer than any of us have been scholars. What you do with it tomorrow morning is your choice. Both of you can do this. Solomon filled his lavers every single day. Every day. Not once at the consecration of the temple. Not once at the beginning of each liturgical year. Every day. The water was continuous. The threshold was never allowed to go dry. He understood something that I did not fully understand until I stood in an alley near the Damascus Gate at 5 in the morning and heard 7 Arabic words. The covenant at the threshold must be renewed each morning, not because the covenant is weak, not because the previous day's declaration failed, because the day is new, because what was sealed yesterday encounters a new morning, a new set of approaches, a new round of whatever is attempting to enter what God has protected. You renew it not from fear. You renew it as a practice of certainty. The same certainty with which the woman in the alley emerged before dawn with her white pitcher, long before the tourists arrived, long before anyone was watching. She was not performing. She was not maintaining a custom for the benefit of observers. She was doing what she has always done because she has always known what the morning is. The morning is the threshold reopening. The threshold must be declared before the day comes through it. Solomon set his threshold in bronze. Permanent. Filled every day. You set yours in water. Every morning. Before the door opens. Before the day begins. Before a single foot crosses the boundary outward. Pia, speak, close the door. You are not performing a ritual. You are maintaining a boundary that Solomon declared must never be allowed to go dry. The woman at the Damascus Gate has never allowed it to go dry. Your grandmother, in the compound before dawn, never allowed it to go dry. The lavers in Solomon's temple were filled every single day. Tomorrow morning, pour. The day after, pour again. You are building waina with 1 cup, what Solomon built with bronze. The scale changes. The theology does not. The threshold is waiting.